Good afternoon, everyone. I'm really delighted to say that I'm speaking again to Isa Blumi, a historian, academic, expert on Yemen, as you will discover during the interview. We last spoke in 2018, Isa, and I would really like, before we start speaking, to direct people to your various publications. First of all, in 2010, Chaos in Yemen. 2015, Ottoman refugees. 2018, and that's certainly the book that I would direct everyone to really fully understand what's happening in Yemen. Your book called Destroying Yemen. And more recently, you wrote a paper, and I also want to try and speak a little bit about that. I read it through this morning and found it absolutely illuminating and fascinating. The paper was entitled Speaking Above Yemenis, a reading beyond tyranny of experts. And this is something that I think it's very important for people to understand, the revision of history in these neo-colonialist conflicts that have effectively been sweeping the world for decades now. And of course, I've been concentrating on Syria, but Yemen has some very interesting parallels. Isa, welcome.
Well, it's wonderful to speak with you again, Vanessa. And again, very much appreciative of your work. It's difficult conditions. But the few and far between the number of people who are actually on the right side and reporting as you are, I'm sure your audience is very appreciative. I am for sure. Excuse me.
Thank you, Isa. I mean, coming from someone as yourself who has lived in Yemen, how many years did you live in Yemen?
2 years in collectively, I would say 2.5 years, but 2 years straight at some point with some occasional trips to the region, a larger region. But I would make quite frequent until 2014, very short trips to meet with certain people, and when it was impossible to travel outside of Sana'a, to meet for a couple of days and observe as the country was going into utter collapse since 2011, the so-called Arab Spring, which induced all kinds of changes in that country.
In your talk, I'll get straight onto that, and then we can come back to what's actually happening currently in Yemen, particularly with the UAE, etc. But you basically talk about the tyranny of experts, as you brilliantly put it, where let's say embedded historians and academics and authors are rewriting the history of Yemen, and they are disappearing important aspects of the narrative of this conflict. Can you just talk a little bit about what you mean by that, and maybe give some examples, some of the more pertinent examples?
Yes, Yemen has long been an arena for very convenient academic and external state collaborations from the 70s onwards, when really the last of the violence that was associated with the Nasser invasion of Yemen in '62, and then the subsequent 8 years of war and violence that finally brought some kind of relative stability, and then an attempt to rebuild northern Yemen. Already, South Yemen had become firmly entrenched in the Cold War as an ally of the Soviet bloc. Nevertheless, it did also receive a few scholars who were spending time. I don't know if I'm going to name names. I don't think that's maybe this is the appropriate time, because I can get you into trouble. But there are a couple of scholars who have already from the 70s onwards a long relationship, working on so-called academic projects, but doing so through various embassy offices, or by extension, aid distribution agencies like the USAID, which was a major sponsor of some anthropological projects that was combined with the agricultural industry, so departments of agricultural studies in Arizona or in Kansas would send so-called experts who would be promoting um, modernization of Yemeni methods of farming, which of course through the USID was emphasizing industrial scale kind of agriculture, one, but two, also diversification and even pushing towards production of cash crops. We will provide you with cheap subsidized wheat, just like they did with Egypt from the
Mm.
50s onwards. You don't worry about feeding your own population. You worry about generating income, so then you can balance, you can more easily borrow money and pay those debts back with hard currency in the future. So this was the kind of economic model, very much associated with modernization theory, which was popular in the 60s, promoted by academics who were, whether they were aware of it or not, you would have to be incredibly naive and stupid, in fact, and didn't quite understand what was going on if you did not understand what you were promoting by taking American money or other European countries' development fund money and going to places like North Yemen to promote certain kinds of agricultural reforms, be pushing certain kinds of economic structural changes that I itemize in my book with some detail, finding a couple of incredible red flags in the archives that demonstrate just how um, programmatic these campaigns were and how important anthropologists and again experts on agriculture. It's interesting the anthropology projects that were being promoted those days, PhDs that were looking into how Yemeni farmers managed their land, managed their water, how they negotiated conflicts over land. And it does make, I think, a clear association with the subsequent decades of attempts to try to uproot farmers from their traditional systems of sharing responsibilities, sharing costs in uh, development of their resources, especially in these terraced fields that they're very famous for. It takes a lot of cooperation. It takes not only one village, but multiple villages to cooperate to make sure that they're able to maintain their terraced fields, to maintain such a productive agricultural base for North Yemen. All this would be disrupted by USAID with UNDP officers coming in, offering alternatives, production of cash crops. For instance, cut became a very lucrative
Yeah.
alternative for farmers. Coffee, obviously, and other, let's say, commodities that could not be consumed locally, but would be exported and would be certainly be quite profitable for those who control those
Mm.
aspects. So you had full-scale academic encroachments, but primarily the main agents who provided this um, cooperative dynamic between development agencies and what are clearly strategies of uprooting and dismantling strong communities that have demonstrated over decades the ability to resist this imposition of IMF decrees or the attempt to force the privatization of land. And more importantly, the foreign acquisition of that land is something that Yemeni farmers have long resisted. And I suspect that many of these anthropologists' primary function is to provide the kind of raw data, the information that was needed in order for them to develop strategies to uproot and destabilize these communities. And sectarianism is certainly one that was introduced by the late 80s, early 90s. It's not by mistake that Yemen became yet again a very popular destination for scholars who got American money, EU money to study sectarianism, Salafism, to study tribalism, as they constantly are referring to as some kind of instrument to understanding what makes Yemeni society function. I've also argued quite often that this language of tribalism is very problematic and
Yes.
obscures to a great extent the complexity of these communities, and in a very convenient way keeps Yemen exotic, keeps Yemen to be in the in the sphere of knowledge that only experts on tribal peoples can provide, right? So it's a very kind of securing this Orientalist ethos that promotes a certain kind of knowledge and that cannot allow for the infringements of very basic common sense about how one actually should approach these very dynamic societies. So this is one of the tools that empire actually implements throughout a third world, the global south that resists. And you can see that happening with Syria, with their constant efforts to dismantle and disrupt how farmers grow food. This last summer, winter has been quite horrible for Syria's harvests. This is what they've been doing to Yemen since the 1970s, at least. And this is my primary concern, on top of the IR types, the think tank types who are just promoting this idea that Yemen is just a safe haven for Iranian influence, and parading this language that we need to protect Saudi interests in the Bab al-Mandab from Iranian encroachments. And the Zaydis are just extensions of Shia activism, and they're connected to Hezbollah, and they are terrorists, and they're a threat to democracy, et cetera, et cetera. So you have those types who are very transparent, and I don't think we should take them, no one really takes them seriously in the end, other than those who are providing them the funds to write their propaganda. But the real structural damage is done by those who came with certain claims of expertise, and they actually garnered some knowledge about Yemeni societies by being embedded within them for many years. And they're now in Washington, they're in London, and they're sometimes publishing whole books, but they're certainly offering content to these think tanks, whether it be the crisis group in Brussels or these other kind of groups that have popped up with not too distant links to various Gulf country money, and certainly whether EU or US State Department money, directly or indirectly. So that's the idea, that we have these so-called experts who are indeed imposing a very narrow way of understanding what is happening in Yemen, and in many ways making themselves the exclusive intermediaries to actually figuring out how to best maximize the interests of empire in subordinating Yemenis to a global economic system of exploitation, of wealth extraction, transfer of wealth from Yemen to the various circles of which require the third world to be subordinate and to behave to service their long-term financial interests. And the Yemenis are not behaving. And it's not by mistake that these so-called experts are mobilizing this hateful language of sectarianism. Probably the most, let's say, effective propagandists in this regard, because they're treated as experts. They end up on TV programs if anyone is asking questions about Yemen. They're the ones who determine which articles are published.
Yeah.
None of them will have, for instance, cited my book, Destroying Yemen. My book has been, I don't know what's the term you would use, but completely ignored. No Times literary supplement, no New York Times interview, no reviews from the main Middle East studies journals in North America or in the UK. So that says a lot, that the academia is completely bought out, whether they're aware of it or not, or they're just scared for their career. They know that they cannot associate themselves with certain ways of framing events in Syria, Libya, or Lebanon, or in Yemen. And that's part of the tyranny, is one, those who are explicitly exploiting their so-called claim to expertise, but then those who are terrified of losing the little that they have in their career by taking a principled position on the affairs affecting the peoples of our region.
Yeah, well, I mean, we definitely are going through a neo book burning culture.
Absolutely.
And as you say, the voices that are actually trying to address the imbalance and the misrepresentation of conflicts like Syria. I mean, for example, you mentioned your book. There's also Stephen Gowan's book,
Mm.
Washington's long war on Syria, of course, which in the same way has been completely cancelled out
Hmm.
by academia. Piers Robinson, who covered the OPCW scandal, the chemical weapon hoax
Hmm.
in Duma 2018. All of these academics, David Miller, these academics who speak out, as Mark Crispin Miller did during the COVID project, are criminalized, demonized, silenced, deplatformed, cancelled effectively. And in many instances, like David Miller, they're dismissed under absolutely no pretext. So yeah, even in the independent journalism sector, YouTube channels are just summarily shutting people down. They're demonetizing. Platforms like Patreon are simply canceling people. So yeah, we're living in a sort of I say unprecedented, certainly in my lifetime, of book burning and tyranny as regards freedom of speech, and it's something that I think across all the spectra we've got to be aware of, and we've got to be fighting back against. We can disagree with each other, but we don't have the right to cancel out someone's opinion just because we disagree with it. And of course, all the social media platforms are there to foment this kind of division, this kind of sectarianism, racism, division along left-right paradigms that are now becoming obsolete, in my opinion, because it's very much now them against us. And we need to unite, just as the Arab world needs to unite against the entire neocolonialist project. So thank you, for being really one of the lone voices, one of the lone courageous voices that is addressing the revisionism. I wanted to mention two other points that you do bring up in your writing about this revisionism. One is the reductionism of the narrative regarding the Houthi, and the fact that, of course, the UN is still underscoring the legitimacy of Mansour Hadi, the president, who had overstayed his welcome anyway, and for various reasons was deposed in 2015, which of course led to the Saudi interference and aggression. And when I'm saying Saudi, of course, I'm talking about the entire coalition, which is headed up by the UK and the US and Israel now, very much more so. So can we just talk about who the Houthi are? Why is this entire resistance movement always reduced down to as you said, a tribal war, the Houthi, in inverted commas, rebels versus the legitimate government? And let's talk about the National Salvation Government that is actually in place in Sana'a, in Yemen, and is effectively trying to run the country without any recognition from the UN, despite, of course, the fact that it has been constitutionally elected, I believe. And that if we go back to 2015, the UN peace envoy Jamal Ben Omar actually said that there was no need for any intervention in Yemen because the Yemenis themselves were reaching a political resolution. So if you can just talk about those 2 points, because I think they are the ones that are always labored by the legacy media and are most imprinted on people's brains regarding the conflict in Yemen.
Right. Okay. So, firstly, regarding the so-called Houthi, I think firstly we need to remember that in the context of the war that was initiated by the Obama administration and their regional allies or assets to reverse the challenge that had been raised by a broad coalition of Yemeni actors. It was not only one particular group, let alone something called the Houthis. And and when the war actually did start, and this new, let's say, coalition government would ultimately be established through whether or not we can call it real elections or not, it is nevertheless functioning as the de facto government of a legitimate government of upwards of 20 million, 23 million people who are living under siege since 2015 in what is geographically formerly the northern part of Yemen. Um, the groups that are now forming what we call a coalition called Ansar Allah would include those who would be associated at earlier times with the so-called Houthi movement, a very specific movement that emerges in the northern province of Saada in the 1990s, mid 1990s, a region that was beginning to face the real threat of expanded both central state power, the attempt by Ali Abdullah Saleh's regime from the successful victory of the so-called civil war of 1994, in which Saleh making certain alliances already in the 1980s with the United States in particular, with Hunt Oil, and had successfully negotiated the unification of Yemen in 1989, 1990, with considerable support from CIA linked financial institutions. There was a big loan offered by Saddam Hussein to both Jordan and Yemen to help create an interesting alternative mechanism, if you will, that was deemed, at least before the invasion of Kuwait, as an alternative to a dysfunctional GCC. The GCC seemed to be going nowhere right before the invasion of Kuwait. And Saddam Hussein's collaboration with certain banking interests eventually ties Jordan and Yemen into an interesting coalition that has dramatic consequences for Yemen with the invasion of Kuwait. Now, the LA Times broke a couple stories from 1990, 91, 92. I cite them in my Destroying Yemen book. And that's something that one of the examples of how history is rewritten or erased, these complicated links between Ali Abdullah Saleh, the war over Iraq in the early 90s, the Bush family, and ultimately what translates into unanticipated consequences of pushing the power that Ali Abdullah Saleh had seemingly been able to secure by forming a very nasty sets of alliances with a group of Takfiri groups that had emerged already with CIA supports to fight the Soviets in Afghanistan. The Mujahideen, of course, through the groups that are coming from Saudi, but through Yemeni, that they supplied the manpower, provide the logistics support. They got training in this transitional zones in northern Yemen. And then they started coming back in the early 90s. And Ali Abdullah Saleh used them to decapitate what remained of southern Yemen's political and military elite in this war of 1994. And this victory over southern Yemen led to new policies of colonization, internal colonization. And it so happened that it's also the same period in which Yemenis are deported from the Gulf in large numbers as a response to Ali Abdullah Saleh's support for, let's say, peaceful negotiations between Iraq and Kuwait to resolve that conflict peacefully, not to have the Americans resort to invading the country and parceling it out as they did in the early 90s. And one of the punishments was that the Yemenis, who are over 1 million strong, working in various sectors of the Gulf economies, but especially in security, which is interesting. So they were being trained as police, and they were many special forces protecting some of these families, in especially the UAE. There are, in fact, many of the ruling families in the UAE have Yemeni mothers or grandmothers. So there's some interesting intimate connections, especially with the south of Yemen, with the UAE that goes back since the British period of Yemen in the early 60s. And so Ali Abdullah Saleh is using similar tactics to what he did successfully to take and peel away the South from its, let's say, homegrown leaders from the old Marxist regime that still existed. And that's to use the colonization of certain areas that were deemed to be out of state control in the north. And that included this Saada region, which is on the border with Saudi Arabia. Now, crucially, this area of Saada is historically on both sides of the so-called border, historically, culturally, economically, and politically still Yemeni in the early 90s. These were borders that were actually not really enforced by Saudi Arabia. Per the agreements that Saudi Arabia, after conquering these areas in the 1930s, they would be periodically renewing these agreements that would allow the population on both sides of the border to continuously travel back and forth. This was very deemed to be necessary. Otherwise, it could be a very destabilizing effect if you try to impose a border and keep these communities separate from each other. It was also quite lucrative. This was a way for Saudi Arabia to get through black market trade all kinds of things that were deemed to be otherwise impossible to import legally. So from drugs to cheap slave labor to weapons and vice versa. I remember being in Sada in 1993, and there was an open air market for advanced weapons. They were offering anti-aircraft weapons, for the highest bidder. And while quite charming, and it kind of plays this image of a wild, wild west, it did have a very important regional economic and political function. And Ali Abdullah Saleh wanted to disrupt that. And he disrupted that by importing and moving large numbers of Takfiris who have experience now fighting in Afghanistan, who were probably already in Iraq in the early 90s. God knows what else they were up to. But they started to establish schools, training schools in the heart of these areas. And this was an area that associates with the heartland of Zaidi, let's say, intelligentsia. Many of the Zaidi thinkers of the last 1,000 years have come from these regions, and it was considered to be a very hostile move on the state's part to bring in these foreign ideas, these guys with very foreign values, who of course were, as they were called, takfiris. They were hostile, and they were actively referring to the people who lived in the region as kufar, right? Kafir. And so this strategically induced conflict. And the more there was conflict between these colonialists from the outside, who had a lot of Saudi money, increasingly Qatari money, as Qatar becomes more and more influential in the mid-1990s onwards, especially with Al Jazeera, the use of sectarianism becomes an obvious tool to try to disrupt the population and the cohesiveness of these peoples. And it so happens to correspond with this move by both Saudi Arabia, the Americans, and the Saleh regime to finalize an agreement on what actually constitutes the border between Yemen and Saudi Arabia. Until the year 2000, in fact, the whole area from, let's say, some 50 kilometers from the Red Sea through these mountainous regions, and then that area from 50 kilometers onwards, all the way down to the border with the shared border with Oman, Yemen, Saudi Arabia were not declared and finalized borders. So these were kind of empty areas that had yet really been developed, but it was also known lots of oil and natural gas was there. So at the same time, the Americans are trying to force some kind of legal establishment of zones of ownership, so that would allow, especially American companies, to start doing exploration, making bids for exploration blocks. And this also directly clashed with the people who are living in these areas. And so it's induced a conflict with the indigenous population that inspired or led to the rise of charismatic leaders who were took the name Houthi, family name Houthi, and it became a very crude, simplistic dismissal of the resistance, calling it as just a fringe, fanatical Zaydi Shia group who are sectarian, who are Iranian-backed, who are support Hezbollah or whatever. And there is, in fact, no justification for the people who live in this region to be rising up. And we can dismiss them. They're just, again, Shia fanatics. And of course, that's not the case. The result is that the resistance from Sada become associated with an individual. All right, it's kind of like calling Hezbollah Nasrallah party or something like that. So therefore, it's a bit it's frustrating when you hear people constantly make references to the so-called Houthi, and so-called experts know. I'm assuming they know this. They know better, but they do this nevertheless because it's part of the vocabulary that's required to reduce this to a very simple calculation. And if once we remove these fanatics, then we can return Yemen back to, let's have someone like Saleh come back to power. Well, he's now dead, but his nephew is around, and he lives in Abu Dhabi, and he has 7,000 men loyal to him. We will prop him up. They even have a satellite television station 24/7. So they're broadcasting their narrative about what's going on in Yemen as we speak. So this was a regional response to a reach of power by the central state. The Americans, who are projecting and trying to establish a kind of order that links this part of the world to the larger global financial mechanisms that directly implicate the oil industries, first and foremost. But the idea that you would militarize this border, which they ultimately did in 2000, unleashed all kinds of responses from the people on both sides of this border. On the Saudi side, that meant the destruction of the very old Ismaili communities along Najran, these border areas. They were all removed, and Takfiri types from Najd were sent down to occupy these beautiful areas of Najran, Asir provinces, which are today marketed in Saudi tourism advertisements as, exclusively Saudi, and they show these beautiful Yemeni structures, and they brag about the quality of the coffee there, and the exotic cultures that the dances that these people perform, and all, of course, a destination for tourists to go and visit. But this is indeed the epicenter, if you will, of the current struggle in Yemen in many ways, is an indigenous local response to a power grab and the very heavy-handed use of an allied state's resources to try to suppress that by Americans, and especially the Clinton and Obama people were very much responsible for the ultimate result in the 2010-2011 so-called Arab Spring, which had two components to it. One was a very legitimate and inspired resistance to Ali Abdullah Saleh, to the global transformations that Ali Abdullah Saleh was helping implement in Yemen. Saleh had basically started to market and position Yemen as a place of investment for Gulf money. Qatar was investing in properties, especially in Sana'a. Again, I itemized these things, chapter 5 and 6 in my book. And Dubai Port World was playing a big game in acquiring big swaths of southern Yemeni port assets. And that became somewhat confused over the course of 2010, 2011, as clearly Washington was not happy with the direction the so-called spring was taking in Yemen. They instigated using some of the various tactics that we saw in southern Syria, the use of snipers, the inducement of chaos and fear on the streets, the taking over of the streets by armed militia that is associated with Qatar, the Islah Party, And that started a dramatic downturn towards internecine violence in Yemen. With the so-called Houthis now the targets for elimination by all the other parties who received fund and support from the outside world. Tawakkul Karman, who got her Peace Prize while promoting Takfiri hatred towards these so-called Shia Houthis, is a prime example of how some of the mechanisms that would be used in the early 2010s to try to bring back some kind of control over what was happening in Yemen, because it could have gone in different directions. And this was destabilizing for a number of actors in the larger region. And the prize of securing, controlling Yemen's long-term assets was something that all three parties that were supposedly brought together by the Obama administration to form this coalition, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE, were actually competing with each other for those very assets. They could not afford for Qatar, for instance, to secure control in Sana'a, which they de facto had through the Islah Party. The attempt by bringing this old vice president, Ali Abdullah Saleh, to power, imposing an election in which there were no other candidates but Hadi to run in this elections that were, of course, was supervised by the UN. Complete fraud. Indeed, if they had a donkey run against Hadi, I'm sure the donkey would have won. This is how despised the man was in 2012. But nevertheless, he was imposed, and immediately he starts to do what clearly European and American interests wanted, was to integrate Yemen into the global economy mechanisms of wealth extraction. He immediately joins the World Trade Organization. He immediately starts privatization process. He starts ripping up old contracts, especially with DP World had that were signed under Ali Abdullah Saleh, and starts opening a new bidding for Yemen's natural resources, vast areas of its onshore and offshore petroleum blocks, for instance, were never bid on. So this would be a period of a new investment in gaining access to what was well known to be a very rich, geologically speaking, very rich region that separates the Horn of Africa with Southern Arabia. Huge offshore oil is already being exploited off of Puntland, for instance, in Somalia, former unified Somalia. And Yemen was going the direction of Somalia. We're just going to break up these territories. We're going to have a couple of warlords where we will make agreements that will give them $100,000 a month. He will assure that the pipelines and the flow of natural gas and oil goes to the port without any hindrance. And this is something that a big coalition, associated again incorrectly as the Houthis, will try to resist. And it is a broader coalition that includes a lot of actors in the south. This is why Ansarullah and the resistance in the northern Yemen are so incredibly resilient, even though they've been blocked off since 2015, even though they have no way of defending themselves from daily airstrikes, which every day destroys more infrastructure. Every day they put more cluster bombs into people's farmlands. Every day they make it impossible to harvest food. There are no bridges left. It's such a horrible situation to try to transport things from the coast up into the highlands of Yemen. It is also, however, a natural fortress. It is impossible for European American forces to ever hope to conquer militarily northern Yemen. They would never be able to do so. But they're hoping to induce, just like with Syria, Lebanon, internal strife, make people's lives so miserable that eventually they will cast aside their support for these groups, no longer avail their young men and women to fight this seemingly endless war. And this is a part of the campaign, is one, to vilify these groups, to call them Houthis, to refer to them as simple Iranian tools, extensions of Hezbollah. This is very important for the narrative for the UAE these days, which has made the fateful decision to openly embrace Israel as an ally.
Yep.
Apparently, Bahrain has done that as well. And clearly, while it's not official, Saudis have been doing that for a long time as well. And to cast this scorn on the people who resist, to call them, resort to calling them terrorists, to very conveniently forget the pretext for the latest use of drone and ballistic missile technology that the Yemenis have long had access to. Before this war started even, they had ballistic missiles and they had very talented engineers. They had the largest military in the Arabian Peninsula before 2010. But this is one of the contributions that these think tank types do, is they constantly obscure the dynamics that led to this horrible war. The very fact that this is a war that's daily, that it's purposely been targeting civilians and their infrastructure from day one. They've been using these old tactics developed during the Obama administration period of double tapping, from funerals to weddings to any other large grouping of people, schools. Yeah. And this continues now with a new, let's say, level of, I think, investment. There's a new ratcheting up, if you will, because of the arrival of the Biden administration. The Victoria Newlands and the Samantha Powers, Susan Rice's, the ones who were the engineers of the Arab Spring and the various wars on Libya and Syria, and indeed in Yemen, are back in power, and I think they've brought back some of their old assets that were somewhat disabled, for rightly or wrongly, strategically, if it was understood by the people who accompanied Trump. But we did see that Qatar's rivalry with UAE and Saudi Arabia manifest into an almost military confrontation between those three. And it certainly did make a mess out of the coalition in Yemen. And that's being somewhat cleaned up now by the Biden people. Again, it's Obama administration too, with the same people who are behind all of this. Yeah. And I think you can see that manifested also in Syria. There seems to be a new kind of, another generation of violence they're concocting. And maybe after the winter, we're going to see more ratcheting up of violence in Syria, unfortunately. Yeah. Because it's certainly happening in respect to Yemen.
Coming back to what's actually happening or rather leading to what's actually happening right now in Yemen, and of course Yemen, as you rightly say, has been more prominent in the news again recently, having been sort of, let's say, superseded by Syria for some time. Syria's kind of eclipsed a little bit, and Yemen has come back into the news again. Predominantly, I think really it centers around the battles for Marib. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, Marib is the natural resources center, which of course all of the three that you mentioned, UAE, Qatar, Saudi, have been trying to control or to keep control of for their neo-colonialist handlers in the US, UK, EU, Israel, etc. And of course the Ansarullah movement has been making very big steps towards completely liberating that area from the various Takfiri groups that are controlling it. And of course, we're hearing the usual narratives, the same that we heard in Syria, as the Syrian Arab Army was liberating an area. Of course, no, it's bombarding civilians, it's besieging civilians, etc., etc. And there's no mention of those armed Takfiri groups that are committing the atrocities against the civilians under their occupation. And the area is being liberated by the Ansarullah nationalist forces, right? And that has led to Yemen taking the war to, first of all, Saudi Arabia, and targeting the Aramco facilities, airports, etc. And now, of course, with, as you mentioned, the ramping up in the UAE involvement in Yemen, the same tactic of taking the war to the UAE with the recent targeting, the missiles were intercepted, but targeting of Abu Dhabi airport as Herzog, the Israeli president, landed for his first meeting in UAE for some time. You know, again, demonstrating the normalization of relations between Israel and, as they describe them, the more pragmatic Sunni Islamic states, which are, of course, the Gulf states, the producers of terrorism, right? So I think it would be really interesting for people to understand better what is really happening. Of course, we've broken down now who the Houthi are to try and dismantle these legacy media narratives. But let's try to give people an understanding of the involvement of all of these players. Why are they there? And why has Yemen decided now to take the war into their territory, let's say?
Okay, so the removal, the arrest, and then the resignation of Hadi in 2014, again, who was this so-called interim president who was opening up Yemen's economy in a very unconstitutional way until this coalition steps in and says, Khalas, you're not going to sell off Yemen through this IMF schemes without having an actual government with a parliament so we can actually have debates about this. This is unjustified use of executive power, which you have no right to do that. So that was the pretext of the intervention in 2015, is the removal of Hadi in 2014. There were attempts, as you mentioned before, by the UN designated representative who was very close to getting all the parties back to the negotiation table, but also then to have elections. That was the primary concern, is to allow us to have elections and let us actually have a representative government to decide the future of the country, which is something that the outside powers did not want. And this was the end of the window of opportunity for especially Saudi, Qatari, and UAE, who again saw very different directions. Yemen was going in very different directions from their perspective. The UAE had a very good relation with Ali Abdullah Saleh. His removal, what UAE saw as their arch enemies, and the ones they most feared, the Qataris, through Muslim Brotherhood type organizations. UAE is petrified that they would see something quite similar happening in their own societies. They knew that Qatari influence and Muslim Brotherhood type organizations were in operation, even though they were mostly underground. They did eventually stamp out some of the more dangerous, let's say, manifestations of that. A lot of people were arrested, a lot of people were deported, ended up in places like Comoros, where they're now living in exile. But it is something that the UAE is primarily concerned about, that Qatari's ability to shape the contours of domestic politics in a number of countries could extend to the UAE. And this is in large part a reflection of not only inter-Gulf rivalries, but it's also a reflection of a very different factions within the United States foreign affairs apparatus. I think Qatar, those who have strong, let's say, old links to the traditional Gulf powers, the Saudi Arabia and UAE, the ones who had long have deep structural connections to the old petroleum-based economies that had shaped much of the Cold War. They were being pushed aside by a new generation. The people like Susan Rice and Samantha Powers and the others who saw that the instrument of Takfiri Islam could be much more actively used to create and induce change on the ground in various target places. And so this is where Qatar felt it had the upper hand in a place like Yemen, even though it was Saudi money that did successfully create a reliable army of Takfiris to go and fight in Afghanistan under the bin Laden enterprises of the 70s and 80s, and then subsequently from in the Balkans or elsewhere, it was actually the Qatari message through their very sophisticated media networks that actually had converted a younger generation of would-be activists slash fighters. And this was their chance to acquire influence in a place like Yemen. They had the media support not only from Al Jazeera, but even from Western media through their darling Tawakkol Karman kind of figure. Who and that was a very sophisticated level of integration of Yemen, of Qatari's interest into Yemen. Again, they had some investments in property development in Sana'a in particular, but they were not necessarily. They did not have the kind of institutional solid. They were not institutionally sitting on solid ground with Ali Abdullah Saleh in power. His removal, thanks in part to the Takfiri Muslim Brotherhood groups that Qatar supported, who pushed aside what were otherwise youth-based groups that really were promoting a non-sectarian, unified Yemeni approach to the future of Yemen's struggles, corresponded or resulted in responses from especially UAE, who put in lots of efforts to try to support Ali Abdullah Saleh's backers, but also this old the Southern Yemenis groups, which eventually became known as the Southern Transitional Council, who started to promote the idea of actually recreating an independent South Yemen, which is something that would have really benefited the UAE, who had, again, long connections with old families from the South, going back to the British period in which the British had treaties with various sultans of the South, who then fled with independence to go to places like Ajman or Sharjah or Dubai in the 70s and 80s. And then we still have the Saudis, who have the states very different strategic concerns moving forward. They, like the UAE and Qatar, have logistic issues. They have financial problems. Again, I laid all this out in my book, Destroying Yemen, and have been trying to emphasize constantly that these are not rich countries with bottomless pockets. They're in fact very strained financially. This is part of the economic relationship that they had to form after the 1973 oil crisis. This is the agreement that Nixon and Kissinger forced on OPEC, especially the Faisal in Saudi Arabia, that the American dollar would be the exclusive currency moving forward for the sale of oil and oil-related products. And more importantly, all the money and resources that would be acquired and accumulated from the sale of oil or borrowing money off of future oil production or gas production would go back into the US economy in one shape or form, either buying treasury bills, buying property, or buying US weapons. And this is a fact that leads to the near bankruptcy of the Saudi family. And we see this with MBS emerging. One of the first things that he does is start to basically arrest cousins and other prominent members of the larger Saudi society and force them to open their bank accounts. And this is a reflection of the calculation is that Yemen's in chaos in 2015. There is the Obama administration who's encouraging that someone step in and bring some order back to the countenance having popular resistance to their decrees, that the imposition of IMF structural adjustments that were devastating for Yemenis' long-term hope of sovereign control over their own assets. And so the idea was that this would be a short war, that all three parties would be able to overcome and secure the lion's share of what Yemen had to offer, which was, again, untapped oil, gas resources, still undeveloped for many, many decades because it was just too expensive to finance the development of these things. The politics were not right. There is a lot of growth potential. But for countries like Saudi Arabia, it also avails the access to the Arabian Sea and the
Yeah.
larger Indian Ocean world. Uh, and this has been their long-term strategic concern. Now, recall that, of course, Qatar has fundamental role, and this is something that's been made clear under the Obama administration. It was to actually provide much of the gas that Europe would ultimately consume in the future. All right, the whole idea with the Islamic State would be that there would be a nice corridor, land corridor between Turkey and Arabia and Saudi Arabia, where gas from Eastern Arabia can go very conveniently up into the European markets that way.
In
Uh,
competition with Russia, of course.
in and basically shut out Nord Stream
Yeah.
of what, and so Ukraine was in many ways a part of that,
Yeah.
right? The 2014 coup was very much along those lines. The war with Azerbaijan and Armenia and Nagorno-Karabakh. Erdogan has successfully carved out a, uh, a supply chain that brings Baku's oil and gas to directly to Turkey and therefore the European markets.
Mm.
And of course, Israel and Turkey have collaborated and have been targeting offshore gas and oil of Lebanon and Syria now for the last 20 years.
Mm.
So these dynamics are also at play. The problem is that the war didn't end so quickly, and it's just dragging out, and they really don't have now a choice. The Ansar Allah forces have their ballistic missile capabilities. They've been using it since at least 2016 on Saudi targets, which are quite easy to hit. And they've, on occasion, demonstrated to the larger world that they can hit even Riyadh. Which has been very disruptive for the hopes that MBS has been trying to encourage foreign investment in Saudi Arabia. They market themselves as transforming. They're going to build all these casino towns on the Red Sea, which none of which are not possible without some stability, without foreign money coming in. They've been again hoping to sell off big chunks of Aramco's assets, but increasingly it's becoming clear that there are no one interested in Aramco, as they saw it as a potential mess in terms of organization. The assets they claim to have in the ground is no longer provable. This is one of the reasons why Aramco is desperately trying to seek access to Marib, for instance. And they are, in fact, siphoning off some 30,000 barrels a day, apparently, that goes into pipelines. And the Austrian company OMV is participating in this, as well as Total Oil, France's Total Oil, and the old Hunt Oil Company from Oklahoma that had long worked with Bush Sr. already in the 1980s to secure Hunt Oil access to Yemeni fields. And so this is a insidious long-term strategy that points to some of the old classic forces that go back to the Cold War. There are some nuance, however, that we need to appreciate the finance side to this. We have to, of course, avoid calling this a coalition in which these three parties are partners. They are not. And this is one of the reasons why the most recent attacks on Abu Dhabi were gestures of warning, to demonstrate that we can bring your economy to its knees within 48 hours. Already we saw the immediate response from markets, from people encouraged no longer to go back as tourists. The even targeting of Expo 2020 most likely caused a lot of cancellations. We will never, of course, hear from mainstream media or from the various ministries just how effective these attacks are, but it's clear that the Ansar Allah has leverage. And one of the reasons why this latest attack on the UAE took place stems back to earlier attacks in 2019 in a similar fashion, just to demonstrate that we can hit your airports, that we can shut your economy down, which is largely dependent on openly trading with the larger world.
Yeah.
And it's largely because of the investment that the UAE has put into rival factions, fighting it out amongst the Saudi and Qatari assets in southern Yemen. They've been frequently fighting with Saudi-backed forces in Aden, for instance. Aden is a very unstable city, switching hands quite often. There's really only one region that Qatar was able to hold control of until very recently, and that was Shabwa, which is one of the other major oil and gas producing regions of Yemen, which borders Marib to the south.
Yeah.
And it happens that Shabwa was late last year, successfully, three large parts of Shabwa were actually taken over again by Ansar Allah's soldiers. And that induced panic. Again, very quietly, you're not going to hear about this in Wall Street Journal or Bloomberg Press, right? Which is a shame because the investors depend on accurate information for them to make good decisions, right? You would think that they would, let's avoid the corruption of Saudi, $1 million going to the chief editor. That's enough to silence Bloomberg Press, but it's ridiculous. But it's true that people are very misinformed because they rely on media that is completely corrupted. The real problems on the ground in Saudi Arabia and UAE are never going to be revealed by journalists writing for this mainstream media. But people were taken by surprise about what was happening in Shabwa and Marib. Marib became somewhat in the news again because the Biden administration is back in power and because they decided to make this the case point in which the so-called Houthis or Ansar Allah are again the instigators of violence. So it's because of Ansar Allah's inability to sit down and negotiate that we have these problems. And the only reason why we get any media attention is because this is the kind of narrative they want to impose on our subsequent analysis of what's going on. And Marib is crucial. It's not a zone of influence for the UAE. It is completely under a combination of Islah, Takfiri groups, and Saudi ones. But it relies on local population at least staying out of the day-to-day operations of this occupation. A lot of oil is being extracted every day. It ends up going through this Austrian OMV pipeline down to the coast. And so this Austrian company is making money without paying any taxes to the Yemeni state. And again, these other oil companies are making bids on, and that's a general problem with conflict throughout the region. Libya, of course, is losing huge amounts of its wealth to these predatory pirate organizations that work with Erdogan or whomever. And so with these, I'm not quite sure who basically made this calculation, but eventually Washington, on behalf of Abu Dhabi, probably because of Israel's coaxing, a reward to Abu Dhabi for publicly embracing this Abrahamic Accords or whatever they want to call it. Shabwa and the resources of Shabwa, this area south of Marib, would be brought into the firm control of the various parties that are associated with UAE's support. And that would only be possible, however, for this now mysterious so-called giant forces who had successfully put pressure on Ansar Allah and secured large parts of southwest Yemen's coastline in 2018, 2019, to the point of actually reaching Hodeidah, the city, the very important port, the last port that North Yemen has with the larger world. And the quest at that stage was clearly the attempt to completely isolate North Yemen from the sea. It failed, and it dragged on. And ultimately, one of the things that changed the calculations of Abu Dhabi were these missiles in 2019 as a warning. And so they signed the Stockholm Accords, which were, of course, within a couple of weeks immediately violated, and every day since late 2018, early 2019. The so-called agreement is being violated by airstrikes from the coalition every day on throughout the west coast of Yemen, killing fishermen, killing farmers. It's a quite brutal, again, tactic of terrorizing local population, making it impossible for them to feed themselves. But in the meantime, these assets that had secured the much of Southwest Yemen's coastline, these are assets that are, for me, quite mysterious. Whenever you see pictures of them, they're all wearing masks. You look at their body types; they're actually quite larger than Yemenis are usually. So my suspicion are they're special forces. I've seen pictures of special forces guys in these distributed Saudi coalition uniforms, clearly twice the size of their local Yemenis. They're making surfer hand gestures, when they're posing with their buddies, and they have high-powered sniper rifles with them. So there's clearly special forces on the ground working on behalf of this coalition. And my suspicion is that the Biden administration has unleashed a new round of collaboration that will try to change the dynamics on the ground, at least to help more efficiently use air power, air superiority, to use new kinds of weapons against these kids who are fighting with Kalashnikovs and very primitive anti-tank weapons and anti-aircraft weapon, which never hits, of course, these airplanes that are flying so far above them. And when necessary, bring in these special types of forces to change the battlefront. And this is what happened a couple of weeks ago with this Shabwa region. And a quick turn of events led to Ansar Allah's forces being forced to evacuate this, what was considered a strategic victory for them. And this also somewhat relieves the pressure on Marib. So clearly, this was something that, okay, you guys have intervened in a new fashion. We are going now ratchet up and remind you that we will bring your economy down within days if you continue with this. And it seems that they've already publicly announced, oh, we've successfully won our battle and defeated the terrorists. And now the these guys that are called the giants are going to be now brought back to Aden or somewhere else. So we'll see how that plays out, but it's clearly the bombing, the very intense bombing now of Sana'a, and that's what we know. We know that Saada has been bombed. They bombed a prison and killed a lot of Ethiopian migrants who were incarcerated there. They're bombing the hell out of Hodeidah still. It's a very, very cruel war that there is no conscience on the part of Washington, London, the EU more generally, let alone, of course, their local assets, their regional assets. And
despite the bleeding heart, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch reports about the humanitarian crisis. Of course, nobody ever mentions that it's a totally manufactured, engineered crisis. I mean, it's the hypocrisy is unbelievable. I mean, globally, not only, but in Yemen, I think it's the most criminal.
And they're trying to put the onus on those people who are resisting. It's because they are resisting that this continues. And the same logic applies to how people speak of Lebanon, right, or Syria. Is that how dare you stand up to our foreign armies, our mercenary armies coming into your country and pillaging and killing, and subordinate.
Eastern Ukraine. Also.
Eastern Ukraine, or many other corners of the world. Many cities of Europe these days.
Exactly.
And many neighborhoods of Europe are resisting, right?
Exactly. So, God
and
bless Yemen.
stealing.
I mean, they're
Yeah,
unbelievable that they've maintained this resistance for under some of the most, I mean, devastating hardship. You know, Syria and Lebanon now especially, are really hard hit. But when I look at Yemen, I just, my heart breaks.
and the cynical destruction of their internet capacities, which of
Yeah.
course should be another crime against humanity.
Hmm.
The civilian use of this is so crucial for a
Yep.
country that has lost all its bridges and has no running water. It's just an endless list of crimes against humanity. And it will never be presented as such.
Mm.
The UN has been bribed many, many times to never investigate any of
Yep.
this. Sadly, China and Russia do not at all stand up in the Security Council to address
Mm.
this. China sells drone technology to Saudi Arabia.
Yep.
The Ansarullah shoots down occasionally Chinese drones that bomb
Hmm.
their assets. Um, there are there is diplomatic there are diplomatic efforts. Oman, which is heavily
Mm.
invested in seeing one this going in one direction and not the other, are very upset by how neighboring Mahra region, just on the border which it shares with Yemen, is being used by Saudi Arabia as a possible
Mm.
conduit for a pipeline that will take both Yemeni and Saudi oil to the Indian Ocean. Uh, they're not happy with all these Takfiri groups being sent there. The local population are asking Omanis to help them and push out Saudi influence. The
Yeah.
occupation of Socotra Island by Israeli and UAE forces is an outrage.
Mm.
Um, and this expands Israeli reach to the entire West Indian Ocean, which should concern all countries in the Indian
Yep.
Ocean.
Yep.
To have one country being able to shut down whenever it wants, air traffic as well as sea traffic is something that is should be very concerning.
Mm.
Uh, so there are a lot of things to continue talking about and watching and observing.
Yeah, I mean,
Unfortunately,
I would really actually love, I don't know, maybe we should actually do a series of talks because, um, you know, this entire conflict is like so many of them, really. I mean, Syria was targeted for more than 75 years with um, endless CIA MI6 interventions. I mean, I recently wrote about that. Yemen, the history is so complex. And I think for people to really understand what is going on, we need to sort of break it down into chunks, easily digestible chunks, because I know how easy it is for people that are not invested in the history of these regions to glaze over slightly when you start really getting involved in that complexity. But I think it would be extremely valuable. We'll see what feedback we get from today's talk, but I think it would be really valuable to go further and to break it down into some of the other narratives like the child soldiers, etc., and to talk about these what I consider to be Orientalist narratives that are not taking into account the cultures in these countries, like Syria, for example. You know, a very patriarchal society. It's never going to be governed in the same way as the UK or the EU, for example, right? And Yemen as well has its very proud indigenous culture, um, to a huge degree, not sectarian. I mean, the Zaydi that you mentioned, the Shia Islam and the Shafi Sunni Islam have always coexisted, as far as I understand. And of
yes,
course,
yeah.
you know, that sectarian narrative is being played over and over again in all of these countries. And I still see relatively informed people talking about tribalism, talking about it being at the root of the conflict, etc. So,
Yeah,
Isa, if you have the time in the future, I would really love to kind of
absolutely.
break
Yep.
down into
We're
other subjects.
yeah. Would I'm here. We're neighbors, and so we should, as best we can, despite these conditions, try to have another conversation. Or again, it sounds like I'm just blabbering on to your audience, but hopefully they have the patience to listen to what I have to say, and I'm certainly happy to talk again with you,
Yeah,
your
that would be
audience.
great. And I'm absolutely sure the audience are not going to think it's blathering one. I mean, I was absolutely fascinated by, I always am, by what you say and what you write. And I hope other independent media channels pick up and have you on, because, I think it's a very important aspect, particularly that of the infiltration of academia, the infiltration of think tanks we know are basically, as you said, created to provide the narratives that the media can then run with, the kind of the approved narratives of these conflicts.
Mhm.
But academia, it's a very worrying aspect,
Yeah.
that there is so little freedom and of speech and diverging views, and that these academics, whether they're aware of it, I mean, I've had some experience with academics on Syria, and some have been very well intentioned, but they've still gone straight to those mainstream sources.
Yeah.
So I think part of it is also a re-education of that sector, and saying to them, look, there is other information, and raising awareness about your work, about the work of others that are really trying to shed some light on these very complex situations. So as I said again, thank you so much, Isa. Your work is so valuable, and I really hope that it gathers momentum and traction, and that more people are reading it and using it in their dissertations now and in the future. Thank you so much for
Thank
coming
you.
on.
Thank you so much, Vanessa. And please take care, be careful, and my best to your audience. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Isa. Take care. Bye bye.